Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is your captain, Randy Wright speaking, and as always, I'm joined on our state-of-the-art radio program by my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton. Folks, this will be the final boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show, while Jeremy and I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, as there really is a lot of news and information to get to before we may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, if there is one indelible lesson that we can take away from this fiasco and debacle known as the 2016 presidential election cycle, it is this: the traditional system of two parties working in the American arena of politics has begun to fail the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours. Of course, I'm speaking of we the people. We see that through successive election cycles, the political parties have become titular heads of the flip side of the same coin. It's beginning to become increasingly difficult to differentiate between the two as we progress forward. And it could also be said that essentially what has happened in America is that the electorate awoke one morning and found some diabolical and nefarious force had come into the American system of polity and had corrupted it for the purpose of tearing this nation apart at the seams. Of course, as we have warned on past episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, the Fabian Socialists, who got their start in 19th century Great Britain, have always been about tearing apart and destroying the system that they currently target. In the United States, of course, that means our traditional supreme law of the land, which pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2, is none other than our shared United States Constitution. It is just a simple fact of reality and a fact of life that we cannot escape. They have been doubling down on their efforts, and as we've said, they've done it initially through a three-pronged effort. First of all, it was done through the education. Our education institutions from coast to coast and border to border have been infiltrated by the Fabian Socialists. It goes back to the father of modern public education, who went by the name of John Dewey. Well, Dewey basically said that it's a bad thing if the up-and-coming generations were able to think for themselves, because that would disrupt the collectivist mentality that he was working so hard to establish. Of course, does that work for the best interests of this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours? The answer is open and obvious, and it is in the negative. It is not good to pervert or pollute the minds of the youth. The next phase that they took over, and the next phase of their operation, was that of establishing Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media. By controlling our sources of information media, they are able to basically dominate the narrative that is disseminated to the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, we the people. And now we see that they have also infested the various levels and branches of government all throughout this representative republic. You see, the political class isn't listening to the people. Of course, George Washington warned us of these dangers during his farewell address. He said that those who adhered to a sort of factionalization were, in fact, allowing themselves to be forced into a specific sort of despotism and tyranny in and of itself. That is something that I think we need to discuss. Because when you look at the way that there is this push for a tyranny of false unity, whether it be with the gutless opposition party or to a much lesser extent with the Fabian Socialist-controlled Democrat Party, we see that there is this sort of attempt to truly silence a great voice of the American electorate. That goes against the natural law tenets, which by their very nature are timeless in scope and application, which underpin and basically form the foundation of not only our Constitution, but also our representative Republican form of government. We have to keep these things in mind because there has been this incessant, unrelenting and well orchestrated effort to fundamentally transform the United States of America, transforming it away from a representative Republican form of government which recognizes the true fundamental and inalienable rights endowed to the wielders of sovereignty, the people, by their creator, the God of nature. You see, when it comes to the Fabian socialists, it's about basically worshiping the symbolism of the devil. Remember that their original iconography was that of a wolf in sheep's clothing. Why would they use this? Well, remember that in Scripture it was said that the devil would infiltrate society and man's kingdoms by acting like a wolf in sheep's clothing. That is how he would infiltrate God's sacred flock. And they basically acquiesce to that idea. That's an empowering symbolism to them. But it's also a symbolism of warning. And it is a direct warning to each and every one of us in our capacity as popular sovereigns to be ever vigilant. But in order to be vigilant, we have to literally redefine the scope of what's happening here. We have to be willing to fight fire with fire. And I know that's something that we have mentioned on past episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, but I think it's true, and even more so today than it has ever been before.
Well, it has to be said, Randy, that, going back to things of a biblical nature, the greatest trick that the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist. The type of trumpery and trickery and chicanery that the Fabians have accomplished over 150 years.
It's stunning and staggering.
It's to the point to where everything that the American people have always railed about, ever since our inception of our republic, the fundamental ideas and principles that we've built this republic on, and I say we, I'm talking inherently we the people, it is a hereditary trait for us. But we've gotten away from that. We've allowed ourselves to become complacent. We've allowed ourselves to forget the annals of history, to ignore history itself, because other things have come along that seem to be more appealing to us. It's the whole giving into temptation. Yield not to temptation, because right. Temptation is sin, and that's what's happened. Our country, we the people, have created and imbibed a great sin. We have done that to ourselves. So we have to get back to fixing the problem. We have to go back to finding out what the root of the problem is, because the root of all problems are in fact the solution. The root of the problem is the forsaking of our Constitution. The Constitution is the solution, period. We need to get back to that, because that's the only way that we can defeat the Fabianism. That is the fire that we need to use against this other fire. That's right. Exactly what has to happen.
It ties into this whole idea that Washington was speaking about in his farewell address. In a sense, what he was saying is blind loyalty to a party helps create this sort of atmosphere we have now. It means that you lose the greater picture. You lose the idea that this republic is greater than the sum of its parts, which is a quintessential part of our nature. Because when you think about the natural law tenets that underpin this entire system of polity, it has to be something that transcends and is greater than this mob-like mentality that dominates when you get into factionalization. And we've seen that this is why America is more divided today than she has been since 1860. In other words, the doctrine of the lesser of two evils, or more apropos here, the lesser of two weasels, doesn't work. Mm-hmm. It led us to this point.
And again, the whole thing, it boils down to this false sense of loyalty. What that does is, not only does it perpetuate the complacency, but it breeds defeatism. So many times we've heard people, I'm going to vote for Trump because he's a Republican and you have to support the Republican nominee. You're being a defeatist. You're willing to forego your principles, even though Trump is not your guy. You don't support Trump, but because he's a Republican nominee, you have to. That's defeatism. It's not just going along to get along. You are defeating yourself. You are forsaking your principles. You're not willing to make a stand. You know it's wrong, but you do it anyways. That is giving into that temptation. That's where it rears its ugly head. And a lot of people are tempted by that because of why. They've become so complacent that they want to feel secure again because they do not have the ambition of what it means to be secure, and that is standing on your own 2 feet, exercising your principles and rights, maintaining them. So you're willing to forego all of those for that lulled sense of security. That's where the temptation comes in, and people have bought into it.
It goes even deeper than that. It goes to the fact that they've bought into these penultimate concerns that have been foisted upon them by a corrupting party. And think of it this way. The parties may have started off as well-intentioned organizations, but the problem is every type of organization like that is susceptible to the type of corruption that we've seen run rampant in these past successive decades. And it's only been getting worse since the time of the cessation of hostilities in the war between the states, or as it's known in the common vernacular, the American Civil War. The reason that it's been getting worse is this sense of entropy has kicked in. But it's also because it was about that time that Fabian socialist mentality began to become prominent in the United States. There was this push for a collectivist mentality, which really has no place in an open and honest society like that of the United States. And of course, as you mentioned, as we divorce ourselves and further distance ourselves from the supreme law of the land, that is when you start to see the societal, moral, and governmental decay that is plaguing this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours. It is a travesty to see it unfurling in the fashion that it has been, but it shows that these forces are out to literally do this. Like that Democratic representative from the state of Louisiana, Barbara Norton, who sat there and said that teaching the students of her state the Declaration of Independence is somehow inherently racist. You see, it's that sort of twisted machination that works in. It's that sort of incrementally pushing and pushing to create a new norm within society to normalize us to this sort of victimology that has become a dominant part of the arena of American politics, that we become desensitized to it. We begin to think of it as a new norm. That's certainly what we have seen play out like a disastrous kabuki theater play on repeat all throughout these truly horrific 2 terms of the Barack Hussein Obama regime.
Yeah, and it's not just the decay of our republic, essentially as a whole. It's individual decay. It's when the
They're
people
inextricably
themselves
linked. You can't escape that.
right, and again, it's when more and more people start to forsake and get away from and forfeit their principles and abandon them. That's where the decay starts. And then it just spreads. It spreads to where it encompasses all of us. We can't allow this to happen. Our founding fathers fought against this very same thing. Fabianism, yeah, it became into the picture in the late 1800s, but there's certain essences of Fabianism that preceded it. Look at the British Crown,
Sure.
Monarchical Fabianism.
Well, remember that any form of socialism, according to Alexis Tocqueville, is just a new age form of feudalism. What
Sure.
is monarchalism if it is not based off of the old feudalist system. It was quintessentially what feudalism was, except that in Great Britain, we saw that there was a bit of a departure from the so-called absolutist style of monarchy that was popular throughout the vast majority of the European nations. And of course, what that was is that the baronage or the nobility had worked it to where they could not be taxed without their consent. Of course, the monarchs worked to get around that. And, Britain never really had a federalist system, nothing like ours. There was only the one representative body, and that was at the national level. Everything else was done through this rather foolish doctrine of virtual representation. In fact, that was one of the great major disagreements that our founding fathers had with respect to this whole notion of no taxation without representation. But the British said that they had virtual representation by the central parliament, but the colonies had no vote, no say whatsoever, really.
Yep, and that actually transposed into the legal system as well. Virtual representation. If you were a colonist and committed the crime, you had virtual representation from Parliament, where they would have delegates come over and represent you, but you had no say in how you were represented. You had no say in the way things played out. You had no voice. You had essentially zero due process. It comes down to it, because the legal representation that you had ultimately was under the thumb of the British Crown to begin with. So we got away from that because of, in part, the Articles of Confederation, but also more so with the ratification of the Constitution. Rights. And we see that.
I think you were saying the ratification of the constitutional rights was a way of addressing that. Sorry, folks, we are having a little bit of technical difficulties here with our connection. Not sure what's going on there, but that is what you were saying, correct?
Yes, yeah, and okay. Essentially, we got away from that and developed into what our legal system is now. And again, it's not perfect. There's flaws with anything, but it is the best and most perfect or close to perfection you're going to get with any legal system throughout the world. And it has been that way for 234 years?
Yeah.
235 years? So
give or take, yes.
Yeah, and again, we're losing sight of that. We're foregoing all of that because of what? Because people are afraid. Because their emotions are dictating their logic.
Well, it's a combination of factors.
Sure.
You see, there is this shifting dynamic of polity that's basically shifting the principles away from the Constitution in this attempt to fundamentally redefine conservatism. Folks, this is why we say that the New York billionaire, businessman, real estate tycoon, and all-around vulgarian Donald J. Trump, also known as John Barron, also known as John Miller, is so dangerous. It's because he is attempting to push conservatism away from what it is into a leftward spiral that would not be welcomed. And it's not just with him. We see that this shifting dynamic of polity takes us away from the true meanings of things. Remember, we've always warned you about this dark and twisted game of semantics, the playing around and monkeying around with the definitions of words, or at least the traditional definitions of words, to change them. And therefore, we must make an effort to fully distinguish establishment from purist.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that we do that is we link it to the Constitution. Now, yes, there is the Constitutional Party, but I don't think they go far enough in fully distinguishing themselves from the term conservative. Now, I know it may seem strange that I am advocating this, but I see that they're already trying to corrupt it like they did with the word liberal. If you hear the word liberal today, your first gut reaction is to think that, oh, that's a big tax and spend government-loving kind of guy, or person. But if you go back to the way that our founding fathers used that term, they called themselves liberal.
Mm-hmm.
Liberal, in the classic sense of the word, was for a small representative republic. It was about individual liberty. It was about popular sovereignty. But you see, as the great visionary Zygmunt Dobbs had warned in his magnus opus, Keynes at Harvard, they were trying to pervert that term, to twist it with their dark game of semantics to make it mean something else. And they were successful in that. And we see that Trump is now trying to do that with the term conservative, which is what was adopted in reaction to that. But conservative, if you went back into the time of the American War of Independence, was considered the monarchical type of approach. So you see, they've already shaken things out, and as these new definitions have settled in, they're now trying to play that twisted word game again. And so I think what we need to do is form a concrete method in which they cannot pervert a new phrase. We have to make it so open and obvious that it cannot be hijacked. And the term I've come up with, which I think will be very applicable and something that we will expand upon as the show goes on, is constitutional constructionist. Now, what does that mean? It means that construction, as in the legal parlance of reading and understanding, constitutional understanding. We are for constitutional construction. We are the constitutional constructionists. That means you cannot go against it because it is the supreme law of the land pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2. And that's where it really needs to be set out. In fact, it is so important that it needs to be in the name of any type of movement that is going to be based on restoring this country back to the path to prosperity.
Yeah, and, again, it's the fact of kind of a rebuilding, or as think of yourselves as
going back to the composition.
Yeah, the composition of it. That is our foundation. What our founding fathers laid out for us. Okay, and it seems that our foundation has become cracked, solvent, brittle, broken, in bad disarray, and in extreme need of repair. Well, when you have a foundational problem of your home, who do you call? You call someone who can actually deal with that. And they are within the construction trade, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, this is kind of, going off on a tangent of with the legal aspirations of this, but I think they're both intertwined. Because, see, we have the foundation there. We have to continue to maintain it and build upon it in order for the rest of our house or our building to be able to steadfast against anything that would try to damage it.
Right. And in fact, a better term than constitutional constructionist is actually constitutional compositionalist or compositionist. Because we have to know what composes it. What is it that composes it? The natural law, to draw it back to those fundamental tenets which are, by their very nature, timeless.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's us as a people, as a republic, sovereign wielders of authority, allowing ourselves to become divorced and complacent from those tenets. This is all intertwining with getting right back to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is always the solution. It's cyclical. Everything in life is cyclical. We have problems. This is why we have the problems, because we've gotten away from that. Now we have to get back to it in order to fix the problems. You can look at the economy. You can look at the housing market. You can look at the unemployment rates. All of those things will essentially fix themselves if our Constitution is followed and adhered to. Because,
of course.
Because the Constitution sets the standards and the parameters for which those things are to operate under.
And of course, the Libertarian Party is not going to be able to cut it. And the reason they're not going to be able to do any of this is they espouse too many positions which are contrary to not only classical libertarianism, but also constitutionalism. For instance, Libertarian nominee Gary Johnson is for forcing Christian bakers to serve LGBTFU WTFLMAO couples. That's not in line with the constitutional approach. I thought the whole purpose of libertarianism was to maximize individual liberty. So, what he's saying is that the iron fist and the tyrannical hand of government is a true and valid use of enforcing someone else's liberty? No, that's not the way it goes, because if you go back to the confines of the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of our United States Constitution, you find that our fundamental and inalienable rights end where another popular sovereign's fundamental and inalienable rights begin.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the fact that the Libertarian Party has gotten away from this should also be sounding alarm bells for everyone else too. Again, it harkens back to that warning that George Washington gave us with respect to factionalization, how factionalization is damaging and causes us to lose sight of things. Well, the Libertarian Party has lost sight of its adherence to the Constitution, just as the mainstay political parties have lost sight of the Constitution itself as well. And in response to this dynamic shift that we're seeing, I think we need a society to combat the Fabian socialists that is the equivalent to them, but the polar opposite. And the only way we can change things is from the outside. Our goal must be to force all political entities back to the Constitution. This means incrementally ramping up the pressure on all political parties. Even the Constitutional Party needs it, because it isn't truly going far enough with what we need, and their influence is still limited to a singular faction. We need something more broad, all-encompassing. Therefore, we must follow Washington's advice about factions. There's a universal application of the natural law and the Constitution, and that must be, first and foremost, what is on our mind and how we approach this.
With respect to the Libertarian Party and Gary Johnson making the notion and the statement of, regarding the bakeries and so on and so forth, it's not only is that completely contrary to the Constitution, but it's taking it a step further from just being contrary to it. What that statement is doing, it's creating the mindset that there are perceived extra constitutional rights.
Which there are not.
Which there are not. So by making that statement, he is allowing people to start to believe that individuals within that community, the homosexuals and lesbians and gays and all these other people, that, well, they have a right to have somebody else bake a cake for them because of their sexual preference. So you don't have to come out and say that they have rights to do that. Just making a statement like that automatically plants the seed of people implying that that's true. And that's dangerous, because, see, this is what the Fabians do. They will twist words. They will, hijack phrases and terminology and twist them in just a way to where people get a misconception of what's really being said. But that's the whole point of them doing that. They say one thing and people start to believe another, and this is where conspiracy theories are born out of. This is where individuals like Donald Trump are born out of, Hillary Clinton.
And so the solution is that we need a movement that bankrolls through crowdfunding. And what I mean by that is we find constitutionalists and we run them in every party.
Yes.
We don't just focus on the Republican Party. We don't just focus on the Libertarian or the Constitutional Party. We put them in all of them. And it has to go back to the original composition of the Constitution itself. In other words, the new movement must be a constitutional compositionist movement. And another reason that this group must be outside of the current existing political parties and structures is because it must be able to step in and become a political party should attempts to redefine the other parties not work. Yeah. And see, the other aspect of it is that it would serve as a transition to slowly work constitutional compositionists away without denying the candidates the backing and structure necessary to win in modern politics and elections. In other words, you're keeping them in the other party long enough until this movement can build itself up to then become viable by itself. So, in a way, yes, it starts off as parasitic, but that is how the Fabian socialists worked.
Mm-hmm. In other words, to actually put it, to simplify it a little bit, you we've all been engaged in conversations that took place between one or two other individuals, and then people have come to us individually, and we've all had this happen to us. You know, friends, family, so on, have come to us as a person on the outside looking in to get our perspective. That's what this is. It's basically we, the people, as constitutional compositionists, putting our perspective out there, regardless if it's asked for or not. We're outside looking in, and while we're outside looking in, we're always going to keep our eyes on them. We're going to monitor them. We're going to watch them like a hawk to make sure that they don't deviate from that. We hold them in check. That is our obligation and duty. It is our birthright. That is what we are supposed to do. That is what encompasses all as having the supreme and being ultimate wielders of sovereignty. It is our responsibility to hold those elected or those seeking election accountable. Remember, we are a society that is governed by the consent of the governed.
Mm-hmm. Plus, the threat of the organization being able to pull funding from all of the parties would make it a powerful force. Could you imagine a constitutional compositionist movement that rivals the NRA with money, power, and influence? Because the NRA is the largest lobbyist group out there. Think of this as lobbying for the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I've always wondered about. Why is it that we don't have anybody lobbying for the Constitution? It's time to start lobbying for the Constitution. They say money is what moves things in politics. Okay, let's put our money where our principles are.
Yeah.
That's why I said that it needs to be crowdfunded. We've seen what Vermont Senator Nerdface Boy Sanders was able to raise crowdfunding. Well, this is where we, the people, come in. This is where our duty, our obligation, and our responsibility comes in. We create this framework to then practice influence on the government, to wield this power that was ours to begin with in a more effective way. And it would mean that the lobbying for the Constitution itself means that, hey, maybe for once all politicians would incrementally start stepping back towards the Constitution because we'd be playing off of their greed. You know, greed is a very powerful tool. We all have an intrinsic sense of greed. It is part of human nature. But the political class has been able to obfuscate it into a way that works against the people. So why don't we turn it around to where they're using it to benefit the people?
In other words, why don't we use our greed of our rights? Because I'm greedy when it comes to my constitutional rights. I'm greedy when people tell me, oh, you're carrying a gun out in public. Yeah, you're right, I am. It's my right. I'm going to exercise it. I'm very greedy when exercising my rights.
But on top of that, you're using the greed of the politicians to start defending those rights.
Yes.
You see, right now, there's no money in defending those rights. There's no lobbying for the Constitution. That's where we've got to get to. That's what the constitutional compositionist movement can start. It's got to be multifaceted.
And there's various individuals and organizations that have been making a valiant effort in defending our rights. We have the ACLJ, the ACRU. You have individuals like Mark Levin, and various other
Judicial Watch,
you know, so on and so forth. And it's everything that they're doing is good and top notch. We want it to be better. We want to make it better. We want to take it that extra step. We want the politicians and we want our government that, again, works for us. They only hold office because we allow them to. We want them to fully understand you are not going to deride our constitutional rights. You are not going to implement anymore these Fabianistic ideologies to destroy our republic. We're not going to stand for it. In other words, no, you will not do this.
Mhm. And because of the shifting
And
dynamics of politics, we have to find a better way to advocate for the fundamental tenets contained within the four corners of the Constitution. This building of this new structure is a surefire way to begin the process. It will redevelop the entire political playing field. Strict adherence to the original composition of the Constitution is necessary for any sanity to return to the United States. We have to plan or have a plan to build this over the next 50 to 100 years. And this is the manner in which we do it. The constitutional compositionists will be able to fund legal defenses for the Constitution as well. We need something as powerful as the ACLU and as organized as the ACLU. All of those various things that Jeremy mentioned, they're great, but they're not unified. They're not acting in unison. And remember, Benjamin Franklin had said, we can either hang together or they will surely hang us separately.
mm-hmm.
So let's hang together. And the way to do that is to have the entire movement unified. Because this is where the whole notion about trying to bludgeon us with the Supreme Court becomes meaningless. The court itself has no meaning if we lack advocates who will act in a cohesive manner and provide legal access to average Americans who might otherwise lack the funding to access the system to defend their rights. The goal is not victories even so much, but to keep up the pressure on the ACLU that they have to expend so much of their resources, and all of these other nefarious organizations are tied up in court so that they can't do more damage as we continue a deluge of assaults to protect the Constitution.
There has to be a modicum of consistency, and that's the straw that has broken the camel's back with regard to adhering to the Constitution. There's been no consistency. Why? Because complacency, defeatism, you have revisionist history, you have political correctness. All of these things have entrenched themselves, dug in like tap roots from a parasite that is just devouring. And again, you talked about the entropy that is set in. It's self-decaying. We have to get away from that. We have to be consistent in what we do. You know, people like Ben Sass, mm-hmm. Ted Cruz, Louis Gohmert, various other individuals we can name, have all been consistent and steadfast on their principles. See, because if you always stand on your principles, if you always stand there, you may be the only person doing it. You may be the only person standing there, but you know what? You can put your head down on your pillow at night, and you can rest without any doubts that you have done what your obligation and duty as a sovereign wielder of authority is. You've completed that task. If you can do that and you stand by that every single day, if you live your life by that model, then nobody can ever take that away from you. Why? Because it becomes your integrity and it becomes your dignity.
One of the things that we could use here with respect to the legal aspect of constitutional compositionists and compositionism is that it would include suing organizations which are purposefully trying to attack the Constitution, but albeit on other grounds. Mm-hmm. So let me give an example of what I mean by this. Let's say, for instance, if an LGBT STFU group refuses to allow someone into the group based on their political, religious, or sexual orientation views, say a white heterosexual Christian male or female. And they aren't allowed in because these white heterosexual Christian males or females are advocating for a return to traditionalism, then we hit them back the same way they have gone after the private bakers. Say, look, you're discriminating. Why are you not allowing them into this organization? They want into this organization because it's having a direct impact on not just the morality of this nation, it's having a direct impact on the system of polity and our rights. And therefore, yes, we need to belong to these organizations too to ensure that all sides are being represented.
You mean true equality?
Uh-huh.
In the absolute sense of the word. You know,
Right.
the true equality that Thomas Jefferson mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. That evil racist document, the Declaration of Independence.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But yet, these individuals, again, this is the problem with those organizations. They want to redefine what equality is.
And that's why we hit them in the courts.
Exactly. You hit them in the courts. You use their own rules against them.
And this constitutional compositionist group would be able to provide that, would be able to structure that, because like Benjamin Franklin said, the way it's happening now is one group is going forth, or one person, or one thing at a time. It's not organized like with the ACLU. They're being hanged separately.
Yeah. Yeah. And see, this is something that I've always told my kids. You know, with dealing with other individuals, you know, whether at school or at work or whatever the case is, you know, they want to play these little games of semantics. I said, that's fine, play the game. But you make them play by your rules. And your rules consist of this, using their rules against them. And that's exactly what we need to do. See, this is something my father taught me. And my brothers. This is one of the great pearls of wisdom that he passed down to me, and I passed it on to my kids. It's kind of reinvigorating and reconstructing that traditional value that's rooted in natural law. You can be engaged with anybody, no matter what the issue is. But when they start to become in such a way to where you are being decayed because there's no way to combat them, or there's no way to counter what's being done to you by them. If you've forgotten how, or you never learned how, or you've learned but just decided not to because it's much easier to just go along to get along, are they really the problem? Essentially, ultimately, no. It ultimately comes back to we the people. We the people have an obligation to ourselves and our posterity to ensure such things as life, liberty, property, domestic tranquility, in order for our republic to be that of a more perfect union. And when we forget about that, or we're so willing to not even engage in that, the individuals that want to tear that down, yes, they're part of the problem, but it becomes a bigger problem. It takes the onus off of them, the burden of proof off of them, and it places it directly on you. This is what the Fabians have always done. They do it through incrementalization. That's their whole grand scheme. Make it to where they present a problem, and then they make it to where, well, we created the problem, but now it's your problem because you took it on yourself, and now you're perpetuating it. They step out of the way, or they leave, they disappear, and now who's left holding the bag? We the people.
Yeah, and let me explain what it was that sort of inspired me to speak about this as the topic for this evening. I read a news article that Mary Madeline herself has left the Republican Party over the ascendancy of Donald Trump. She stated that the changing dynamic means that those who adhere to the Constitution have to rethink the current party structure. It is her opinion that 2016 will be the end of the two-party structure. I know there's many who claim that it would be impossible to do so. They try and claim that a two-party system has always been here, but in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Because what they forget is that the United States has not always been merely a two-party system. The Republican Party itself had started out as a third party response to the failing Whig Party, which, by this way, was itself a third party against the failing Federalist Party.
Yeah. And there's also individuals that say, well, if there's a third party that pops up, it would surely be the death of this nation, of the republic. I don't agree because, again, we point back to the Whig Party and the Republican Party in its inception. You have the Bull Moose Party, which is nothing more than a fanciful Canadian way of saying the Progressive Party. We've weathered through all of these different changes, these political dynamics that have shifted. And guess what? We are still here. Essentially, to this day, as we speak into our microphones, we are still a constitutional representative republic. We are still the light on the hill, that shining beacon of freedom and liberty. And God willing, we will be that way 235 years from now. But it can only happen if we the people decide to embrace this and decide to do what we're supposed to do. Take up our obligations. Don't forsake them. Adhere to our duties.
And a lot of this is rooted in the fact that so many just don't realize that in the history of this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, that there were these various third parties. It's so important to recall that there were these third parties. Remember, it was the War of 1812 that destroyed the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party had been diametrically opposed to it. And when it turned out to be a victory, that was the death knell for that party. So the Whig Party emerged. But the Whig Party emerged before the Federalist Party went extinct. And everybody was saying, certainly throughout this 2016 presidential election cycle, that this is the cycle in which conventional wisdom is going to be cast by the wayside. Well, what is the conventional wisdom that has been there since these two preeminent parties have become stalwart and entrenched within the American system of polity? It has been that these are the only two valid parties or viable parties. That's conventional wisdom. And if we're going to cast conventional wisdom by the wayside, then we need to cast aside this notion that the two parties are the only way to do this. Now, of course, I'm still saying that we should try and force constitutional compositionism onto the two parties and to the other parties, even the lunatics in the Green Party. Because we have to be like the Fabians. They tried to infest everything. We have to do the same, but taking it back to truth and reality. And yes, while this will be a long and drawn-out process, it'll be easier for us to do it than the Fabian socialists, because as Aristotle said in his Art of Rhetoric, it is much easier for people to accept the truth than it is for them to accept a lie.
Sure. Even though people may not like hearing the truth, they will accept it when they know that there's no other way that it can be done. And, I kind of want to make an analogy here. Me and my crazy analogies. And this one doesn't deal with homes or, biblical references or anything like that. This has to deal with fighting oil fires. Now, one of the easiest ways, in the traditional way of putting out a fire on an oil derrick or in an oil well, when the well catches fire, what do? You blow it up. And when I say you blow it up, you don't just blow the whole oil well or derrick up. You actually remove all the oxygen. You create such a enormous explosion that it depletes all the oxygen around it. And once all the oxygen is burned up, the fire puts itself out. That's what we need to do. This needs to be that kind of an explosion to where we take all the oxygen away from the fire that is burning, known as the Fabian Society.
Hmm. And it goes to the lines of what John Quincy Adams had said when he said that you should always vote for your principle, though you may vote alone, and you may cherish the sweetest reflection that your vote is never lost. Well, let's expand that. Instead of just merely voting our principle, let's reestablish our principle. Let's make
Yes.
our principle be accepted in all aspects and facets of society through this constitutional compositionist movement. By being the ones that take it back to the true original composition of the Constitution, and thereby also the fundamental and inalienable rights and the natural law tenets that underpin this entire system and keep us free, we are taking the next step to ensuring the vitality and viability of this system will be able to go on. And we have to do it in such a way, in such an incremental fashion, that the Fabian socialists will be slow to catch on. Because that's what they did. It's essentially this idea of slowly boiling a frog to death. If you just throw a frog into boiling hot water, it's going to hop right out. But if you put it in, room temperature water and slowly heat it up until boiling, it'll just sit there until it dies. That's what the Fabian socialists are trying to do to us, so we need to do it to them in incremental fashion, not expecting instant gratification, because I think that's one of the biggest pitfalls and shortcomings that they've used to exploit those of us on the right. We think that because we have truth and justice and reality on our side, that it should just easily be accepted. But the problem is that they have indoctrinated the youth. It is going to take re-education to get around that. And
Well,
that means incrementalism and time.
sure. I mean, look at what the Fabians' underlying agenda was: to destroy anything that resembles the United States, to destroy the Republic, to destroy any modicum of freedom and liberty and true justice in the world. That's what they've wanted to do. Now they've succeeded overwhelmingly in Europe. Overwhelmingly in Europe. But they met some resistance here in the United States, and that resistance is fading away. And how did they do all of this? How did they begin this? It started
Education.
with their mantra. Okay, they infested with education, the revisionist history and all this other stuff. But there was three things that they implemented into the school systems, into the church, into the government itself: booze, pornography, and drugs. They've made it socially acceptable for people to partake of sinful actions, become sinful with partaking in alcohol. Now, folks, at the end of all of our shows, we talk about our flight attendant bringing back one last round of alcohol. See, drinking alcohol is not necessarily a sin or a crime. In fact,
All
it's
things
not a
in
crime.
moderation.
All things in moderation. The thing is, with the Fabians, they pushed so hard for pornography, for drugs, for alcohol. They were behind part of the movement with the bootlegging and the prohibition. See, what people don't understand is, with prohibition, they created prohibition. Why? As a problem.
An attack on your rights.
Well, it's an attack on your rights, but also they created a little bit of a problem in order to foster and nourish an even larger problem. So they create the problem of prohibition. Well, drinking is bad, alcohol is bad, it's going to do this, this, and this. So we had prohibition. Prohibition was repealed because they wanted it to be repealed. They were all for repealing prohibition. After they started it, they wanted to repeal it. So they create the problem and come back in and offer up a solution. And now when prohibition was repealed, what happened? Over the past, 30 years, we've seen how many countless deaths due to people consuming alcohol in an illegal fashion. The Fabians are loving it. You had organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who've actually outlived their usefulness, just like the unions, because they set out to do one thing: get stricter laws pertaining to drinking ages and alcohol laws. Well, they accomplished all of that, yet they're still around, but what are they doing? See, this is what the Fabians do. They will create all of these little entities, and they will create all these little problems to foster larger problems. Same with the war on drugs, okay? The Fabians were real big into heroin or opiates and cocaine use back in the day. Remember, Coca-Cola used to have cocaine in it. They got rid of it.
Originally a medicine.
Yes. And they want to take things that may seemingly be good in moderation, with the exception of pornography, but the pornography is real. It's a wild tangent of a variable, because see, when they get the drug use in place and they get the alcohol use in place, then drugs and alcohol, of course, you're going to have pornography, because people are not in their right state of mind because of overconsumption or doing this or doing that. They're going to lead into things. But you have to remember, drug use, alcohol use, and pornography has been around longer than the United States. It's been around longer than the Fabians. It goes all the way back to biblical times. They've taken things out of history, brought them back, created minute problems with them in order to foster bigger problems. And then they stick it to it, and that creates mass confusion. And it's all done through incrementalization. This is what their whole agenda is.
And, you know, part of the reason for this outside external force is that there are those who play the part of conservative but don't really mean it. Like Narco Rube EIEIO. I'm sure you all recall how Rube EIEIO had once claimed to be a part of the Never Trump movement. Like with everything else, he's proved to be a sellout in that, because he's now come out and said that Trump is the best salvation for conservatism. Wrong. Trump will be the death knell of conservatism if we do not stop him and start implementing this type of a system that I'm speaking about here. Now, this type of a system will still be able to work. This constitutional compositionalist movement will be able to work irrespective of whether Trump wins or not. But it means it's going to take that much longer, because he's going to do that much damage to it. And it's going to take, you know, it's really going to work against us with respect to the Fabian socialists, because they think they're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. They think that that is their goal within grasping distance, that they can just reach out, touch it, and taste it already. We have to be the force that stops that.
Well, we have to make it perfectly clear right here, right now, that this is not going to be an easy task, regardless of who is elected president, whether Hillary or Trump, or even if a third party is elected. A third party candidate comes in and disrupts the whole thing and is elected president, and Hillary and Trump are left sitting out by the curb. Regardless of who becomes president in November, who is elected, we cannot just sit back and say, okay, Hillary didn't get in, or Trump didn't get in, or neither one of them got in. We got somebody else in that's actually going to do this and do that. We cannot become complacent. We cannot be satisfied with that. We can never be satisfied with just a little bit of the problems being solved. We have to be vigilant. We always have to be on our guard. We have to have a watchful eye, like a hawk. Whoever is in office, for any office, we have to hold them accountable. We have to watch them when they do something that is contrary to the Constitution. We have to be vocal about it. We have to take action, meaning we have to call them, we have to write them, we have to publicize letters if need be, come onto the show if need be, and voice our concerns. It is our God-given rights to do this. It is our moral and ethical and legal obligation as sovereign citizens to do this. Because if we fail to do this, we then become, we allow the perpetuance of complacency, which will ultimately become our own enslavement.
And then on top of this, we need a way to influence these people outside of the political party structure. For instance, with Rubio, there's been talk from Don Trumpolini, the mafioso quafioso, to have him run for the Senate again. This after he betrayed the voters and constituents of the state of Florida with the Gang of Eight? I don't think they're going to forgive him for that, but the mafioso quafioso doesn't care. But where it could matter is you see that the gutless opposition party, or GOP, controls the strings for funding for these re-election efforts. And a lot of that can be taken away if there is this outside force that is able to do funding, where you donate to, say, a constitutional compositionist organization that then will shell out the money to vetted candidates that take a pledge to uphold the Constitution, sign a legally binding contract to uphold the Constitution, and if they go against that, the funding dries up. You see, that is how we can exert much greater influence. Again, it goes back to this whole idea of why do we have no one lobbying for the Constitution? Why do we not have this organized thing to use the corruption against itself? That's the problem.
Yeah, and it brings up the question that you raised earlier. All these other organizations or all these lobbyists, they're going to lobby for organizations like LTFU, WTF.
I'm sorry, you're going to have to repeat that just a little bit. You're breaking up a bit here.
Well, what I was saying was if organizations, lobbyists, coming and going, doing this, raising money, it's like you said, why can't we have an organization that goes for this? People say, well, lobbyists, they're worse than some of the elected officials. If you lobby for a cause that is noble and just, such as the Constitution, I don't think it's so much of the point of just trying to get funding for that or for those candidates. It's putting out there the notion or the idea of individuals getting back to the Constitution. The money that is raised through crowdfunding or whatever for those particular candidates would in all the parties, once they're interjected in all the parties, that just perpetuates the cause. The true underlying cause is to wake people up to getting back to the Constitution.
Right. And you see, part of the underlying problem is look at the way that Trump has lied about being able to self-fund. Remember, that was the big claim that he made all throughout the primary process, that this was about him and he was doing this, and that's how you could know he couldn't be bought. But now that he's in, he's got that George Soros lackey who was a part of Goldman Sachs. And remember, they attacked Cruz for his wife being an employee of Goldman Sachs, and that supposedly meant he was owned by him. Well, the hypocrisy of it all, the lying of it all, this pushing of this really twisted, mudslinging, vulgarian campaign style, and now the GOP is going to march lockstep with him, taking money and donations for Trump. This is, again, where this external force could become so powerful and influential over the American system of polity. You know, they always whine and complain, saying that there's too much money in politics. Well, here's the way that the little guy can get a chance to speak. The crowdfunding. Remember, that's what Boyne Me Sanders did?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we do that and set it up in an interest-bearing trust and have it to where it can then be disseminated to certain candidates and it builds up over time and is able to invest and increase on its own, then you've got something that can become a very powerful force. But it will still be controlled by the people. And the trust will set it up to where if you try and change anything with respect to strictly adhering to the Constitution and what composes the Constitution, then it means that the trust shuts off all the spigots.
Sure. Now, I know people would raised the question, well, how does Article 5 of the Constitution come into this with having a constitutional convention for ratification of other amendments to the Constitution? How would that work in with this in regards to, strictly adhering to the Constitution, but with the crowdfunding, having, let's say we have a candidate within, the Republican Party and then one within the Democrat Party, but they start to have kind of conflicting views. And that one wants this amendment, the other one, is against it, so on and so forth. How would we quash that whole scenario?
Well, it's easy. It goes right back to the Constitution itself. So if you start to see conflicting views with respect to these amendments, go back to what the Constitution currently says. Go back and see where it would more closely mesh with the original aspect. And then, of course, the way that you would deal with that in the Convention of the States is you would have the funding set the convention rules for certain things being a supermajority vote within the convention by the delegates, and then certain things that are of lesser importance maybe just being a basic simple majority. It's got to be on a sliding scale, much like our own constitutional convention worked. And that's literally what we could base it off of. Because remember, it's going off of the original composition. Well, how long did it take? On May 25th of 1787, that's when they got started with this whole thing.
Great day in history.
Mm-hmm. It was all started on that day, and it wasn't until what? 1789, give or take?
September 17th.
And then really, if you think about it with the Bill of Rights, we're talking December of 1791.
Yeah.
That's how you do it. You go by the rules and you take your time. You don't rush things. Again, kind of this idea of approaching it in an incremental fashion. Let it be debated, let it be worked out, then let there be negotiations. You see, that's what the quaffwaffle and the quaffioso mafioso doesn't understand. There are times for negotiation, and then there are times and things that are non-negotiable.
And I think, Randy, it's going to be easier than people believe. It's certainly going to be easier than what it was then when they had the Constitutional Convention, because remember, as we spoke before, they did it in secrecy. They did it in secrecy because if anybody found out about it, they kept the windows closed, because if anybody found out about it or it leaked out, they could have all been hanged for treason. So because they've given us this document, this freedom of speech, the freedom to peaceably assemble, we don't have to worry about that. So it's kind of a burden taken off of us, which should allow us, since we don't have to worry about that, essentially, I mean, according to the Constitution, of course, we know that there's going to be entities that want to oppose us and would be willing to come after our, us, our families, friends, organizations we belong to, so on and so forth. But again, this is why we fight back with them using legalese. It's the same concept of denying a person to become a part of or join with a certain organization through discrimination. We just hit them right back with it. See, we have more authority and more power and more ammunition than people would want to realize. We don't have to sweat the small things about being called traitors or being called seditionists, because we have the freedom of speech to do this. This is our government. It is our obligation. Under the Constitution, we have to do this. We have to. And if anybody wants to stand in the way of this, who's the traitor? Who's the person committing treason and sedition at that point? It's certainly not we the people.
Right. And you see, by being able to not only control the funding, but also to have another way that you could kind of go about resolving these disagreements is, remember the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers? That's another thing that the constitutional compositionist movement could do. It could sit there and disseminate these writings these arguments to the people and then let the people come together and vote on it as referendum. There's another way to do it.
Sure. And this is where civil discourse comes in. And disagreements and debates and so on and so forth. See, we can have meetings, conventions, town halls, whatever the case is, to debate the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers and how they apply to the Constitution. Because with new things that have happened throughout our history, new technologies, new issues that have come up that have been challenged in the Supreme Court, we can always look back to the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers on how they apply to these new unforeseen things that were not noticeable or known back then. So now new lines of debate. But the thing is, that brings about interpretations regarding the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. People are going to interpret them a different way, and that's fine. That's perfectly legitimate. Why? Because those things are open for interpretation. What is not open for interpretation is our United States Constitution.
Right. And it has to be linked in to the process. You see, because again, when you think of the Constitution, it is a contract. It is governed by contractual law, and therefore, think of it as what we call an attestation clause. You are able to debate things until it is made concrete as part of the contract, and then the only way to change it is to amend it. Well, that's what the Convention of the States is. That's what it's working towards. And so, yes, you would have these sorts of legal debates. They'd be held in town hall type meetings. It would be discussed, and if necessary, the people could have their say. And again, what the constitutional compositionist movement could do is to organize that, to see that it runs smoothly, and to ensure that all that are involved, once again, swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution, and, we make sure that that's monitored.
And we
that's
can even
where it plays out,
And we can even create the setting on how one of these conventions in these meetings would take place. Certain delegates, people would be delegated, of course, to go and represent, constituents, not because they're running for public office, but because they have been nominated by we the people to represent, from maybe it's, a certain district or even at a county level, to go to this convention. And first and foremost, there would be the Pledge of Allegiance, and then everybody there would take that oath to uphold, protect, and defend and support the United States Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And then there would be a reading of the minutes, or so, whatever the case is, and it would transpire from there. And then we would open the floor for debates, 2-minute debate on this and that, whatever. And if there's a topic that came up, this is what could be applied to as a precursor to a constitutional convention for a ratification of another amendment to the Constitution. This could be a precursor to it. This could also be a precursor to a nomination of an individual to represent the constitutional compositionist party, or have a delegate to run under the Republican Party or the Democrat Party, so on and so forth. Why do people, and see, this can drastically change the scope of this. I mean, let's look at our electoral process now. It's become nothing but a joke. Let's stop making it a joke. Let's take it serious and reinsert some form of sincerity into it. Why do people have to be a Democrat just to run in the Democratic Party?
Yeah, well, that kind of got shot down a little bit because what's Bernie Sanders? He was an independent.
Yeah. So they've already set precedent for this. So why not take it and run with it? See, they've set this up to where we could put this into full swing and motion and run with it. What are they going to do? Say, no, we don't play that. We don't play by those rules anymore. Well, guess what? You wrote the rules when you allowed,
opened the door.
Yeah. you get back to in having to do things in a seemingly unconventional way now, which was the way things were done back then.
Hmm.
Go back. Let's get back to a traditional way of doing things, knocking on people's doors, talking to people at random in the street, so on and so forth.
Hmm.
It's just not done anymore because people have their faces buried in their technology. They have their faces buried in their work. They have their faces buried in everything else except what traditional values are. People are and again, all of this is brought about because of the incrementalization of the Fabian movement. They've sought out to destroy the family structure and the family unit. They've accomplished that. We need to get back to that. And we need to get back to it in such a way to where, like you said, they cannot twist it, they cannot bastardize it, they cannot take it for anything other than what it exactly is.
And it ties into this whole idea of what we're trying to do here, first and foremost, at any and all levels, is get back to the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way things are right now, our entire system of polity has divorced itself from the very notion of strictly adhering to the Constitution. They don't want to because of the way that the system has been hijacked, thrust away from that, moved towards this untenable, unacceptable thing. And when you stop and think about it, the reason that's happened is we have the career politician type thing. This can also be something that would dull the edge of that. Yes, they would still be quote unquote career politicians. But if we control the purse strings, think of us as being kind of a power of the purse over the power of the purse in Congress.
Yeah.
By being able to have that kind of influence, and again, it being related directly to the people, not just to a centralized organization. You see, that's part of the problem with the NRA. It doesn't let its members have much of a say. The members, in fact, have hardly any say at all, if any at all. This would have a say. You would have a say in this. There would be elections in this. It would be run in that fashion. Think of it as that great idea of the form of government in which the people exert the most control over having the most power. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to reset the power dynamic. Because the Fabian socialists, through their incrementalization, have turned us away from the proper power structure and source. Well, the way we combat that is with constitutional compositionism.
Sure. And I want to touch on something you mentioned with regards to career politicians. See, this was another facet, another ploy, if you will, that was used against Ted Cruz. He was labeled as a career politician or as a staunch politician to begin with, just because he's held office. This is a problem. This is one of the things that invigorated, all the Trump supporters, and is bolstered up Trump as him again. Making the label that he is an outsider, he's not a politician, and he used that as a jumping off point to where, again, it's the whole thing of creating a small problem in order to foster and usher in a larger problem. He created the small problem of, well, I'm not a politician, I'm an outsider, and then he created this bigger problem for Ted Cruz as labeling him as a politician. See, this is all straight out of Goebbels' principles for propaganda, the use of labeling. That's exactly what he did. This is what Fabians do. Now, a lot of people say, well, Trump, is going to shake things up. I don't care. The fact of the matter is, when you use Fabian socialist tactics to achieve what your agenda is, whether it may be the most noble of agendas, but when you do that in order to deride an equally noble agenda, or one that may be even more nobler than yours, you create a false positive. Trump has told everybody, I'm going to build a wall. He's attacked the illegal alien issue, this and that. I'm going to build a wall. It's going to be great. It's going to be big. I can tell you it's going to be huge. But he did all of that as
Subterfuge.
it's all subterfuge and political banter and fluff. Why? He did it to lay the foundation and the groundwork to destroy what would stand in his way of accomplishing his agenda.
And his agenda is more diabolical than people might realize. Remember, when he said that it is the Republican Party, not the Conservative Party, he's not just merely trying to kick conservatives out of the party. He is also trying to redefine conservatism. He wants it to be like what's in England, where in England, the Conservative Party is much more akin to what the Democrats were 20 years ago. It's still very left-wing, but it's slightly less left-wing than the Democrat Party, or the Tories or the Liberals over there.
Yeah, and the thing is, he's trying to confuse individuals with that by saying, well, John McCain is not, a true conservative. Well, he's right. John McCain is not a true conservative. John McCain, I don't think, ever was a conservative. And he wants to, again, use the labeling to redefine conservatism. He wants people to think that he's talking about what true conservatism is in regards to Thomas Jefferson, which Jefferson was more of a classical liberal or libertarian. But conservatism, what conservatives now believe, true conservatives believe, they model themselves after Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Mason, Patrick Henry, so on and so forth. But he's trying to paint that image for people. But again, that's just a facade. That's all it is. And he creates that facade by attacking people who, and preaching to the choir. We already know John McCain is not a conservative, never was. We already know Lindsey Graham is not a conservative, never was. Paul Ryan, Jeff Sessions, various other individuals, Mitt Romney.
We do have to give Lindsey Graham, and it pains me to do this, but it's because we here at Wright, Radio Aviation Excellence,
on the Second Amendment,
Flyer.
he is a staunch conservative on the Second Amendment. But the thing
he has been principled against Trump. Gotta hand him that. We give credit where credit's due.
Absolutely.
On the whole, he's still an excrement sandwich, but at least he's not a soggy excrement sandwich.
Yeah, with soggy burnt toast. But the point is, Trump is again utilizing words, phrases, buzzwords of playing to people's emotions. He'll say, they're not conservative, and that's him trying to appeal to conservatives, or more so, not so much to appeal to conservatives, because true conservatives really see the forest for the trees with Trump. They know exactly what he's all about. It's those individuals that have set their principles aside, but still want to try and claim that, I'm conservative and I'm voting for Trump because Trump's a conservative. They've been bamboozled. And he's playing that emotion and trying to redefine conservatism. And again, this is why he attacks individuals who we already know are not conservative. Remember, Randy, it falls in line with that article you showed me about the 25 points of propaganda, as far as propaganda being utilized and so on and so forth. It's creating a false dichotomy is what he's doing. He's taking something that is already known, a known element, and then reworking it to become, it's an even more of a known element now, in order to usher in something completely different than what his agenda is. And then they latch onto it, and then he fades away from it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what he's done. That's what he's done ever since he threw his quaff into the ring.
And what a bad quaff it is. But what we have to do here is, by taking control of these external factors, and once again, infusing the American system of polity with the say of the people, with the power and influence of the people, what we're doing, in a sense, is shaking things up. They say that Trump wanted to shake things up. No, 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 no. This is how you really shake it up. Because the way that the system has been attacked, it's got a parasite in it. And we have to kill the parasite one by one by one until it's gone. And that parasitic thing is none other than the Fabian Socialist movement. And the Fabian Socialist movement has been working towards the absolute destruction of this representative Republican form of government and depriving the true ultimate wielders of sovereignty, we the people, of their rightful sovereign authority, which is endowed to them by their creator, to rework and destroy the system from within. And remember, that was always the statement, that America would not fall by some external force. They would fall from within. But it can be preserved by an external force. Think of France and the way that they helped us in the revolution. That was an external force that helped us secure victory. Again, these are the things and lessons that we can learn from our relatively brief yet illustrious history. There is a great cornucopia and wealth of knowledge to be used to secure the future for this nation. That's why we say do not fear so much about the future. Because, okay, let's say, worst case scenario, let's say that Hillary gets in and all of a sudden she transforms into Joseph Stalin's pet bird on a Sunday afternoon. And now all of a sudden she picks the ghost of Pol Pot to be the next Supreme Court justice. And then all of the other Supreme Court justices suddenly spontaneously combust, and then she gets to choose Lenin, Mao, and Mussolini and Ho Chi Minh just for craps and giggles.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. The court will then be dominated by Fabian socialists for generations. But here's the thing. We keep chipping away. We keep chipping away by overwhelming the system. Use Cloward and Piven against them. That's why this plan has to be built over the next 50 to 100 years. This is why I'm saying it's not instant gratification here, folks.
Sure. And in some circumstances, depending on what events may play out, there, along the way, there may be some small modicum of instant gratification if we pay attention to history.
Right.
See, history shows us how Hitler came to power. Everything that Hitler did while he was in power, it was all incremental. And if we start to see that happening here, we know exactly how to stop it. And we know how to stop it dead in its tracks right there. Those are the instant gratification moments, but even those are going to be incremental over the whole 50 to 100 years. So let's not, confuse things of saying, we have to work for the next 50 to 100 years in order to maintain and preserve our republic. First of all, we have to, for the duration of anyone's lifetime, past, present, and future, you always have to work to maintain your republic. Always. That will never go away. You always have to do it.
The 50 to 100 years is just a modicum of time to get it to where it's not in dire straits.
It's to solidify the republic to where the foundation is built up enough and fortified to withstand any future attacks once the Fabianism is vanquished, to prevent it from coming back again.
Because the way it is now, what we see happening now is that there is a lopsided foundation. They are undermining the foundation. They're digging away at it, and so we're seeing it tilt. We're seeing there being this kind of bowing within the body politique and the societal framework of this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours. So again, it falls on us to fix it. And remember, folks, we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, are not just about disseminating this information to you. We are about informing you with practicable real world solutions.
And
It may
actually
not be,
applying them.
yes, and it may not be the best solution, but it is the best solution that we have at the moment,
Yes.
because everything else has failed. Everything else has failed. Just working within the party, building up grassroots organizations, that has not been enough. Therefore, we're taking it to the next step. We're thinking more along the lines of what Washington said. That is a voice of warning coming out from history, saying you need to step back from the system of polity, this idea of factionalization, and get back to the more important overarching issue, which is the Constitution. And that's what this constitutional compositionist movement is. Now, with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. We're going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back so she can give you just a little thimble of alcohol so that Jeremy doesn't get angry over there with Fabianism. As always, ladies and gentlemen, I'm your captain, Randy Wright, and I've been joined by my first officer, Jeremy Grapington. We want to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. We invite you to leave any questions, comments, or concerns you may have either here on our YouTube page, on our Facebook page, our Google Plus page, or you can follow us on Twitter and can basically have a convention of throwing things at us there by following us at Radio Aviation EX. One more time, folks, that's at Radio Aviation EX. And there you will find the departure board that lists my personal Twitter account, the personal Twitter account of Jeremy Grapington, our Blogspot page, which includes audio blogs, and Jeremy, tell them about the Cafe Press account.
Well, on the Cafe Press account, we have oversized thimbles. They resemble shot glasses and drinking glasses and whatnot. And by the way, folks, those...
Oh, they're bigly.
They're bigly. And trust us, folks, they will fit perfect in your hands. And they're not too big for your hands, although if Donald Trump was to buy one... thank you, Mr. Trump, if you do, but you might need two hands in order to handle that oversized thimble. We have various other nice novelties and trinkets, apparel, hats, even dog tags, folks. It's summertime out.
Cool.
It's don our tank tops and t-shirts and whatnot at the beach with our flip-flops and sandals, so on and so forth, and show off the dog tags with the first class passenger logo on it. Let everybody know that you truly do enjoy listening to the Wright Flyer, and show us a little bit of support.
Thank you again, folks. We'll see you next time. Do take care.